astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
I believe that this nation should commit itself.
12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
To achieving the goal
5,
before this decade is out.
2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Liftoff, the clock's running.
On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to set foot upon the moon.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
4 months later, Apollo 12 successfully landed on the lunar surface, and astronauts Peter Conrad and Al Bean walked on the moon November 19, 1969. And in April 1970, NASA launched the crew of Apollo 13 into the vast ocean of space to continue man's lunar exploration. But 56 hours into the mission, a devastating malfunction left the spacecraft leaking precious oxygen and the crew of 3 astronauts facing a life and death crisis.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
We could have lost O2 tank 2. We got to get a pressure readout on that thing.
O2 quantity number 2 is 0.
We are vetting something out into space.
Apollo 13's mission priority was no longer lunar exploration, but survival. With ground teams working around the clock, NASA faced the formidable task of returning the crew safely to the Earth.
Failure of the oxygen tank on Apollo 13 almost brought the mission to an end in a catastrophic way.
The mood in mission control was immediately one of disbelief.
I have absolutely no clue to what happened. Something happened to the fuel cells in the oxygen tank.
We're going to hit 100 psi in an hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there.
So they only had a few minutes of power left.
We're still 70 to 80 hours away from the Earth.
We were running out of time to get the spacecraft back on course.
I don't think we should ever believe that rescue was inevitable here.
Without use of the lunar module, the mission was lost.
What do you think we got in the spacecraft that's good? It looks grim.
This 2-part film will tell the story of the men, the mission, and 13 remarkable factors that cemented Apollo 13's safe return to Earth as NASA's finest hour.
I'd say this is as serious a situation as we have ever had in manned spaceflight.
April 1970. NASA's Apollo space program is in full swing. The last 16 months have seen 12 men fly to the moon and 4 walk on its surface. For the crew of Apollo 13, preparations continue for NASA's most ambitious mission yet. Navy captain and veteran astronaut Jim Lovell is mission commander. Lovell is one of NASA's most experienced astronauts, and Apollo 13 will be his 4th spaceflight.
Well, I was among the second group of astronauts that came into the program back in 1962. My experience before consisted of basically naval aviation, mostly in the testing field. In NASA, I was assigned to 2 Gemini missions. Frank Borman and I were assigned to the Gemini 7 mission, and then Buzz Aldrin and I completed the Gemini program with Gemini 12. After that, I went into Apollo. I was a backup, actually, to Mike Collins. Mike had a neck injury, so I replaced him on Apollo 8. I then was a backup to Neil Armstrong on Apollo 11, and from there I worked back into Apollo 13, and that's where I am now.
The early astronauts who ranked for commander status in the early Apollo missions were test pilots who were very necessary for really getting hold of these beasts, putting reins on them, and wringing out the very best that they could in performance.
2 other former experimental test pilots will fly alongside Lovell on Apollo 13. Ken Mattingly, assigned as command module pilot, and Fred Hayes will fly as lunar module pilot. For both Mattingly and Hayes, Apollo 13 will be their first flight in space. But just 7 days before the launch, the mission is already facing problems.
It all sort of started just before the flight. As we are approaching the final phase of our training, a turn of events occurred, and Ken Mattingly was exposed to the measles.
Ken Mattingly was the only member of the prime crew who didn't have immunity to measles.
At that time, we had to make a big decision. It was one which was not easy for me to help decide, and when they asked me what I wanted to do.
The flight surgeon's decision was that it was too big a risk to fly Mattingly on the mission, and therefore Mattingly was pulled from the Apollo 13 flight, and Jack Swaggart, the command module pilot on the backup team, was substituted.
The only apprehension that I have is that you work together as a crew. We did find that we did almost everything the same. And once this was determined, I had no apprehension at all. I felt that it was my job to get Jim and Fred there rested. I felt I could do that. I felt I could accomplish the majority of the orbital science objectives of the flight. I felt that we had a good mission and we could do it all.
Jack Swaggart will now fly as command module pilot alongside Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes. Apollo 13 will be his first flight in space.
The main mission objective of Apollo 13 is basically the scientific exploration of the moon. We hope to find out a lot about the origin of the moon, and from that, the origin of our own planet, the Earth. We have, of course, a secondary objective in continuing the development and testing of the space systems itself for, of course, in future flights to other places.
Apollo 13 really went to take a step further than the previous two Apollos that had been on the moon. They had landed in areas called mare, these sort of flat plains, which occupy quite a bit of the moon's surface. And they contain no digging implements, really, so you only looked at the rocks that were right on the surface. And there's a lot of interest in, really, what's happening down below the surface of those mare. So Apollo 13's aim was to go to an impact crater where some huge collision had happened with an asteroid. That impact had thrown material out, and it sort of dug it up from lower regions of the crust. And Apollo 13 was targeted to an area called Fra Mauro, where there were uplands that had some of this material, this impact debris exposed. And that was really their main aim, to try and get to rocks that were characteristic of a different age of the moon compared to Apollo 12.
The particular objective of 13, of course, is a highland landing. We'll use the lunar module to land in a mountainous or hilly terrain called Fra Mauro, to explore Fra Mauro on foot, to look and find out exactly how it was formed, and also to deploy an experimental package called ALSEP.
It was a mission where the crew were definitely very interested in the science. The previous flights had been mainly engineering flights, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, although a lot of science was done on both of them. We decided that we were going to have a heat flow experiment, which was going to measure any potential heat coming out of the moon, and that needed a drill, a Black & Decker 12-volt drill, specially developed to drill these 3-meter holes, 1 inch in diameter, on the lunar surface. It was a more sophisticated piece of equipment than flew on Apollo 12. Having the drill was a difficult thing to work on. They had to drill the 2 holes, they had to put probes down in them and have all this connected up to the central station. It was the most complex experiment that we had up to that time. But 13's motto was "From the moon knowledge," and the crew were really enthused with the science they were going to be doing and to do the best they could with our equipment. And we had a very good working relationship with them.
But the American public does not share NASA's enthusiasm for the next Apollo mission. With the Vietnam War raging on and US ground troops having faced fierce combat for over 5 years, public interest in the moon is fading fast. People believe Apollo 13 will just be another routine flight.
Public interest in the Apollo program reached a height in July 1969 when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, but it rapidly decayed after that. There was some press coverage of Apollo 12, but by the time Apollo 13 flew, very little interest was shown. In fact, it was said that the TV companies, the broadcasters, were inundated with complaints from members of the public that their favorite programs were going to be bumped off schedule to cover Apollo 13.
It's interesting how quickly the public, and I guess we're talking mainly the American public, but worldwide as well, how quickly they sort of got a bit bored with it all, because it all seemed to go just like clockwork, didn't it? And people had got completely fed up with seeing the crew weightless and just poking at bits of equipment that nobody could understand.
I think one of the problems there was that NASA was not emphasising enough the science that was going on and the knowledge that was coming back. So interest was waning until the accident. And some people thought the accident was a stunt, just to get interest back again, but of course it wasn't.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. Now, as we move into the final phase of the countdown, we're receiving go, no-go checks from various elements of the launch team. The spacecraft test conductor gave the test supervisor a spacecraft ready. And the director of launch operations has given Apollo 13 a go for launch. T-minus 1 minute and counting. First stage, second stage, third stage going to internal power. T-minus 25 seconds and counting, and Apollo 13 is go. "17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Houston, go at 30 seconds.
Roll complete and we're pitching.
Roger that.
You feel a Saturn V launch. It actually shakes you. You really are willing it to go.
Altitude 1.2 miles, velocity 1,500 feet per second. Stand by for mode 1, Charlie.
It's like millions of thunderclaps going off. All the simulations are done, all the rehearsing is done. Now it's time to get on with the job.
And 13, your go for staging.
Go for staging, Roger. We're EVS manual.
But 5.5 minutes into the mission, the crew feels unfamiliar vibrations during the second stage boost.
Step forward.
We confirm inboard out. Jim Lovell reports the inboard engine has shut down a bit early.
Suddenly, the central inboard engine shuts down 2 minutes ahead of schedule.
The early shutdown worried the crew, and they reported to the control center, something's happened, can you give us a reading on it?
Houston, what's the story on engine 5?
Jim, Houston, we don't have a story on why the inboard out was early, but the other engines are go and you're go.
Roger.
They were quickly reassured the other 4 engines were completely capable of getting them to orbit, so they knew within a few seconds of it happening that it wasn't going to affect the mission.
To Mission Control, the cause of the engine cutoff is a mystery, but it's a mystery that may have saved the entire mission.
During the ascent through the atmosphere, vibrations built up in the vehicle. In fact, these vibrations, known as pogo because of the way that the rocket vibrates along its axis like a pogo stick. These have been known since the beginning of flight of liquid-fueled rockets.
Pogo was a recurrent problem with the Saturn V's large engines, and could create such variation in their thrust that the vibrations could literally shake the vehicle apart. On Apollo 13, there were 3 instances of pogo vibration. The first 2 were similar to pogo that had been seen previously, but the third almost brought the mission to an end in a catastrophic way. The central engine of the second stage was vibrating vertically 16 times a second, and severely flexing the Saturn V's framework.
So they had sensors in to detect when this was happening, and one of those sensors shut down the center of the cluster of 5 engines.
But had the vehicle gone through another cycle of growth of this pogo, it would have taken the vehicle outside of the structural limits, and that would have been catastrophic. And it's the Apollo 13 flight that galvanized the flight engineers to actually go back and revisit pogo, because it was obvious that the vehicle had been taken very close to failure, and pogo suppression measures were put in place.
13 Houston, trajectory's good, thrust is good.
Roger.
And we don't have too much of a handle on why the inboard cut off early, except that it apparently was an engine problem, but we're certain that you'll be able to make TLI based on what we're looking at now.
Roger, nothing like an interesting launch.
That's right.
After the early engine cutoff, the flight continues as scheduled for the first 2 days. Apollo 13 is on course for the moon, looking to be the smoothest mission of the program so far.
Okay, you're on candid camera. We did notice one thing, Vance.
Right.
Can't comb your hair up here.
Well, I guess you have to give up something.
And I thought we could get a picture of Jack, just so that all the girls know that he's still here.
Yeah, we appreciate that. There he is, Big Jack.
Apollo 13 presently at 177,861 nautical miles away.
"55 hours and 46 minutes into the mission, the crew finish a television broadcast showing how comfortably they live and work in zero gravity.
And now, for the benefit of the television viewers, Fred's engaged in his favorite pastime I found out on this flight so far.
He's not in the food locker, is he?
That's his second favorite pastime. He's rigging his hammock for sleep on the lunar surface now to try it out to see what it's going to be like.
Roger, sleeping and then eating.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult here, Jack, getting into a hammock in 0G. I'm not sure if I keep floating away from it or it keeps moving away from me. We might give you a quick shot of our entertainment on board the spacecraft, which has been keeping us company for some time. This little tape recorder has been a big benefit to us in passing some of the time away on our transit out to the moon. And it's rather odd to see it floating like this in Odyssey while it's playing the theme from 2001.
Okay, Jim, it's been a real good TV show. We think we ought to conclude it from here now. What do you think?
Roger, sounds good, and this is the crew of Apollo 13. Wishing everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey.
Apollo 13, Houston, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
Okay. Stand by.
7 minutes after finishing the broadcast, Mission Control instructs Jack Swigert to turn on the fans inside the spacecraft's 2 liquid oxygen tanks, a routine procedure to stir the tank's contents. But as the fan inside the number 2 tank switches on, damaged wiring creates a spark.
The flight up until about 56 hours was, I guess what you'd call entirely nominal. We had followed the flight plan. We were ahead of the game.
Fueled by the oxygen, a fire spreads inside the tank. The rapid pressure buildup ruptures the oxygen tank.
Fred was still in the lunar module. Jack was back in the command module on the left-hand seat, and I was halfway in between in the lower equipment bay wrestling with TV wires and a camera.
High-pressure gas floods the fuel cell bay in the service module, blowing out a 13-foot panel of the spacecraft.
When all 3 of us heard a rather large bang, just one bang.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Stand by, they got a problem. We got more than a problem.
Okay, listen, you guys. Fuel cells 1 and 3 are offline.
Right. That's what we're reading.
Flight engineers at Mission Control immediately respond to their instrumentation, which is indicating a major systems malfunction in the command service module.
Well, we're showing low N2 pressure on fuel cell 1. We're showing low O2 pressure on fuel cell 3. That can't be. Yeah, we might have lost fuel cell 1. And it looks like fuel cell 3 is gone. I can't believe that right off the bat.
2 of the spacecraft's 3 fuel cells appear to have been lost. These fuel cells are the prime source of electrical power in the command service module.
With the massive buildup of pressure from the cracked and split tank, there was a tremendous release of energy that not only blew the panel off, but shoved up the shelf on which the 3 fuel cells were sitting.
The shock closed a number of valves, and the fuel cells were running only on the oxygen that was in the lines from the valves down to the fuel cells. So they only had a few minutes of power left.
Fearing the spacecraft's hull may be damaged, Swigert rapidly attempts to seal the tunnel hatch between the command module and the lunar module.
The source of the bang not immediately determinable, and I was afraid that we might be vulnerable to losing pressure, so I proceeded to get the hatch in.
We're starting to button up the tunnel again.
5 times Swigert and Lovell try to lock the hatch in place, but the crew decides to stow the reluctant hatch and turn their attention to a new problem.
The oxygen pressure had gone in cryo tank 2, and the pressure in tank number 1 was rather slowly but steadily decreasing. It was obvious it wasn't holding its own.
We lost O2 tank 2 pressure. We got to get a pressure readout on that thing.
O2 quantity number 2 is 0.
My concern was increasing all the time. It went from, I wonder what this is going to do to the landing, to I wonder if we can get back home again.
Looking out of the command module window, Jim Lovell sees gas venting from the service module into space.
And it looks to me that we are venting something out into space. It's a gas of some sort.
Roger, we copy your venting.
Not only is the number 2 tank completely empty, but the remaining oxygen stores in the number 1 tank are now leaking into the vacuum of space.
And when I looked up and saw both oxygen pressures, one absolutely 0 and the other one going down, it dawned on me, and I'm sure Jack and Fred about the same time, that we were indeed in serious trouble.
Although the command service module can operate on just 1 fuel cell, it requires an oxygen supply to generate power.
The force of that massive expansion of gas caused leakage to begin in the number 1 tank. There was insufficient pressure coming from that tank to keep the 3rd remaining fuel cell alive. Within 2 hours, the 3rd fuel cell had to be shut down.
It was quite apparent to me that it was just a question of time that the command module was going to be dead, that we were going to lose that fuel cell also.
That's the only means of electrical power for everything needed to get the crew back to Earth alive.
200,000 miles from Earth, astronauts Lovell, Hayes and Swigert are now flying towards the moon in a dying spacecraft. NASA must devise a plan to bring their men home. before the remaining fuel cell fails completely.
Apollo Control, Houston, continuing to closely watching oxygen quantities, and if necessary, the 13 crew can use oxygen from the lunar module.
At the beginning of the Apollo program, NASA needed to develop a system that would successfully fly astronauts to the moon and back, and the decisions that were made will now directly influence Apollo 13's chances of survival.
At the very start of the program, when it was just drawings on bits of paper, there were a number of options, and various parts of NASA preferred various options. One option was to build a huge rocket, much bigger than Saturn V. It was called the Nova, and just send them straight to the moon, land the rocket on the moon, and then it was so big it had got fuel to come back. This was favoured, I think, by von Braun, actually. Then there was another scheme which had you go into Earth orbit, and then you separate out into various units, and some of them travel to the moon and some of them don't.
The system NASA committed to, known as Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, uses two separate specialized spacecraft, the Command Service Module and the Lunar Module, known as the LEM. The Command Service Module consists of two sections: the pressurized command module capsule that housed a crew of 3 astronauts and the equipment needed to fly to the moon and back, as well as survive re-entry and splashdown, and the larger service module that provided propulsion, electrical power, and storage for the command module consumables, such as oxygen and water. The lunar module was designed to fly 2 astronauts down to the moon's surface, while the 3rd astronaut stayed in lunar orbit in the command service module. Therefore, the lunar module had its own independent life support and power systems necessary to support the 2 men while they explored the moon. Within 3 hours of the tank rupture, all oxygen stores in the service module will be lost, along with all supplies of water, electricity and propulsion, and the command module will be unable to sustain life. But the benefits of the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous system are about to offer Apollo 13 a chance of survival.
Flight Econ. Go ahead, Econ. The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We're going to hit 100 psi in an hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there.
We're starting to think about LEM lifeboat.
Yeah, that's what we're thinking about too.
We figure we've got about 15 minutes worth of power left in the command module, so we want you to start getting over in the LEM and getting some power on that.
It was apparent, and the ground told us so, and they were right on the ball all the time, that the only way to survive the situation was to transfer to the lunar module, and we started going through procedures to get power on and to align the platform.
With its independent life support, power and guidance systems, the lunar module can act as a lifeboat and keep the crew alive.
The lunar module could act as a lifeboat because it's an independent spacecraft and was designed to go down to the lunar surface and come back, which meant it had a lot of capability, propulsion capability, life support and guidance. They were able to use all those functions as a backup to the failed systems in the command module.
The lunar module was the only vehicle available to get them out of a very tricky situation. Without use of the lunar module, the mission was lost. I mean, everything was lost.
Contingency plans to use the lunar module as a lifeboat had been drawn up by NASA earlier in the program, but now these plans and the spacecraft itself will be tested to the limit.
Gee, I think back in Apollo 9 we first started looking at the LEM as more or less a lifeboat, and fortunately, although the exact procedures do not tailor the exact case we've got, we had looked at the utilization of the LEM for an awfully long time, so we knew what the limitations were. We developed workaround procedures wherever it was possible. I think the LEM spacecraft's in excellent shape, and I think it's fully capable of getting the crew back. I think, as we have found before, every time we've put the LEM spacecraft to a test, it's always done much more than it was guaranteed to do, and I think this is a good case in point.
So a lot of thought had been given to the possibilities of rescuing the crew. Well, we didn't end up with a rescue capability. We didn't end up with a system that had duplicates. But we did have a system that could be turned on its end and used in a completely different way.
1 hour after the oxygen tank rupture, the dying systems in the command module have started draining power from the re-entry batteries.
On Apollo, electricity was generated from fuel cells which use oxygen and hydrogen to react. And so the loss of oxygen in the service module meant that the spacecraft could no longer generate power, and the only power remaining was in batteries used for re-entry.
During a normal mission, the command module capsule was separated from the service module just prior to re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. But this separation severed its power supply from the onboard fuel cells in the service module.
So you have to have batteries in the command module to keep you going, and the re-entry batteries do that job. And without them, you can't operate the command module through re-entry.
We have 3 re-entry batteries in the command module, and we have no way of recharging these things now with the fuel cells gone, so we don't want to waste any of this valuable electrical power by running unnecessary equipment in the command module.
The command module must not run on the re-entry batteries any longer than necessary. Without these batteries, the crew will not survive the hazardous descent through the Earth's atmosphere. To minimize power consumption, Mission Control initiates emergency power down procedures.
We've really got to get that battery off the line.
Econ, I think we ought to start powering down.
Yeah. The emergency 1-5, power down.
Okay, 13, this is Houston. We'd like you to go to your checklist. Emergency pages 1-5. Power down until you get an amperage of 10 amps, less than what you got now.
All non-essential systems in the command module are shut down except for the guidance computer, which holds the critical parameters needed to direct the spacecraft home. The crew must now race to power up the lunar module and transfer these guidance parameters to its onboard computer before they lose power in the command module.
It normally took 3 to 5 hours to power up a lunar module. They had to do it in 90 minutes.
They were really rushing to close down the command module and bring the lunar module up from cold.
They had to use modified lunar module power-up procedures, and these were developed very quickly between the crew and the ground, and they had to shortcut to get the lunar module up to keep them going.
We knew that the command module was going to lose it pretty soon because we were going to lose power. The first milestone was to get alignment on the LEM platform. Alignments are important because without knowing exactly which way the attitude of a spacecraft is in space, there's no way to tell how to burn or how to use the engines of that spacecraft to get the proper trajectory to come home. So we had to have an alignment on board the spacecraft.
A very important phase was when they were leaving the command module. The LEM attitude system didn't know where it was pointing.
Alignment of the guidance reference was normally done using stars. The problem after the incident was that there was debris floating around the spacecraft.
There was a whole bunch of particles like fireflies in a night sky. Jim Lovell was totally unable to get any sightings.
Fred and I went into the lunar module. Fred got the power on. We started to align the platform.
They needed to transfer guidance system knowledge of where things were pointing from the command module to the lunar module.
We used a procedure that was in the activation checklist. Jack gave us the angles.
And so they had to manually actually read the coordinates out and shout them into the LEM, and they were punched into the computer there.
I was so concerned about the ensure that this arithmetic was correct that I had actually called down to the ground, let them do the math, came back in and put it in. But we did get a platform alignment, and that was our first milestone.
Once the guidance parameters are logged in their lunar module's navigation system, the command module is powered down to preserve precious re-entry batteries. With the lunar module acting as a lifeboat, NASA has stabilized the situation, and the crew have been bought some time.
My own personal involvement was that I was in the mission evaluation room. The mood in Mission Control was immediately one of disbelief. There was that sense that, okay, we've got a problem, it's the data. We see dropouts often, you see failed sensors giving erratic and spurious information. And then you begin to realize that there are a lot of things, and this is minutes, this is not hours. In minutes, you begin to realize there's a cascade of events which are tumbling, which means that they can only have one root cause. And the initial reaction was stabilization, to get the whole mission stable so that we could at least buy a bit of time.
If the situation remains stable as it is at the moment, there's no question but what we have the thing under control and we can return the crew safely to the Earth. Now, we're going to have to make some compromises in procedures as how you do that. But if everything remains as is, we can get them back successfully.
But we were running out of time to get the spacecraft back on course. So rapidly there had to be, okay, there's no time for stroking our chins, wondering what's going on. Now's not the time to try and diagnose what the fault was. That will come later. Let's deal with the here and now, go forward, straight on.
We were trying to figure out what to do rather than to play out the old data.
And that's what we'll be doing till we get them back on the water, is concentrating on everything that is their lives are dependent upon at the moment rather than worrying about the accident, because there's nothing we can do about that now. The service module is no longer useful in most cases because the oxygen is depleted.
Essentially, assimilate as much data as possible, assign people to study those particular problem areas on how we keep the crew alive and how we keep our options open.
I was involved with the ALSOP experiments. I was a test engineer working at the Cape. We were called in the middle of the night telling us that it had happened. We went in and we had a discussion about whether we could use our nuclear power plant, which was on our experiments, on the ALSOP experiments, to give them extra power. They'd have to go outside, which would mean using a lot of oxygen because you'd have to depressurize and repressurize again. They'd be working with a hot 1500 degrees fuel capsule, manoeuvring that in zero-G, getting it into the generator, and then finding a way of connecting that to the power system. And it was decided it was just too dangerous. They just would not succeed in doing it.
I worked as a support contractor to the Guidance and Control Division during Apollo. My impression during the early time of the mission was great concern for understanding what had happened and the best way to get out of the situation. And although there was a lot of tension among all the people, nobody really lost it. They somehow kept going and encouraged the crew. The crew, more than anybody, knew how serious the situation was. One gets the impression of a sort of calm, searching for answers, but nobody really getting upset. And I think if anybody had really got upset, that probably would have been very serious.
NASA must now focus on the best strategy for returning Apollo 13 home. The free return trajectory was a flight path to the Moon designed by NASA earlier in the Apollo space program. Established by the Saturn V rocket, this trajectory would send the command service and lunar modules towards the Moon and use the gravity of the Moon to slingshot the spacecraft back to Earth without the need for further propulsion. The advantage of this trajectory is that in the event of a systems failure on board the spacecraft, the crew would still return safely home. However, as the Apollo space program progressed, the free return trajectory would restrict NASA from visiting more scientifically interesting landing sites. Therefore, a hybrid trajectory was flown from Apollo 12 onwards, where the spacecraft would maneuver away from the free return onto a specific translunar trajectory to reach their landing site. Prior to the oxygen tank failure, Apollo 13 had departed from the free return trajectory. But with its limited power and consumables, it is now vital that Apollo 13 maneuvers back onto the free return trajectory to make use of the Moon's gravity and slingshot back towards the Earth. Failure to get back on the free return will see the crew locked in lunar orbit, adding greater strain on the already limited consumables. But with the condition of the service module and its large propulsion engine uncertain, NASA is left with no option but to use the lunar module's smaller descent engine to fire the spacecraft back onto the free return trajectory.
We're going to make a free return maneuver of 16 feet per second at 37 minutes from now. That's a 16 foot per second dip burn in 37 minutes. Roger.
Many years before the first landing, one of the senior managers must have had a bad dream or something, because he said, what if that main engine that we need to get us back to Earth fails? It drops us into moon orbit, but we've no means of reigniting it. I want to know, he said, if the lunar module's propulsion system and its onboard consumables can be worked in such a way that it can get the crew out of moon orbit and on their way back to Earth. And those tests were done. And Grumman, the manufacturer of the lunar module, conducted tests to see how you'd steer the attitude of the two spacecraft from the other end, how you'd use the descent engine, normally used for going down to the surface of the moon, to boost you back out of moon orbit and back to Earth.
I had never tried that before. I really don't know who had, and it's a very difficult task. And we spent a lot of our first part of our emergency or survival time just learning how to control the spacecraft in this mode.
Almost every facet of the procedures that were used to get the crew back had been simulated in one way or another, but the really, really crucial thing which everybody feared was that nobody had put those all together in a string of events. It was always thought, well, this might happen, that might happen, one or the other, but never all in a row as they did on 13.
With time for the course correction running out, Mission Control and the crew worked quickly to configure the lunar module for the free return burn.
Okay, here we go, the mid-course correction for free return. And I have your LEM GDA angles. Pitch, 5.86. Roll, 6.75. Your dip throttling, 5 seconds at 10%. Burn the rest at 40%. GDA angles, pitch, 5.86. Roll, 6.75. Dip throttle, 5 seconds at 10%. Burn the rest at 40%. Roger. Okay, Jack, we have a mid-course for free return. Okay, master arms on, 1 minute. Roger, Aquarius, and you go for the burn. %. Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good. Okay, you're looking at 1685 now, Jack. That's affirmative, no trim required. Roger. Auto shutdown. Okay, Houston, burn complete. Roger.
With the successful firing of the lunar module's descent engine, Apollo 13 is once again on the free return trajectory back to Earth. But with only a 45-hour lifespan intended for a two-man crew, the lunar module must now be configured to keep 3 men alive for over 90 hours.
Our feelings varied during the emergency. There were moments when I didn't know how much consumables we had, whether we could make it back or not, but in a situation like that, there's only one thing you can do. You just keep going, and you just keep thinking up where you can get more consumables. And so that's exactly what we did.
Well, the lunar module is not a big space. It's about the size of 1.5 telephone booths inside. To enable it to support 3 men for 3.5 days, the whole way in which it was operated had to change.
A big problem that faced them initially was what we call the consumables, so the oxygen, the electrical power, as it turns out the water, and then crucially towards the end the carbon dioxide. They had rather a small amount of electrical power in the command module, but they had oodles of it in the LEM, so they weren't really worried about lasting a couple of days in the LEM. Interestingly, they had a fair amount of oxygen to breathe in the LEM as well, and it's not difficult to understand why that was, because of course the LEM was planned to go down onto the lunar surface and open the door and let all the oxygen out, so they got plenty of oxygen to breathe in the LEM. Electrical power for the LEM was available, but the real crucial point was that they needed water to cool the electrical equipment. You can imagine all of these high-power things all jammed into this tiny space, so big problem with getting the heat out.
You can't cool electronics in space because vacuum doesn't conduct heat, so you don't get convection. So you need to cool them in an active way, so you run cooling water on cold plates, you put the electronics on cold plates. That's what we did on Spacelab. And you can keep things cool, stop them overheating and failing.
Mission Control estimates that the spacecraft will run out of water 5 hours before Earth re-entry unless the crew restrict water usage as much as possible. All non-essential systems in the lunar module are powered down, and the crew reduce their water intake to a fifth of normal consumption, but suffer serious dehydration.
They powered down the lunar module as much as they could. I think it was only drawing about 20% of the power that it normally would, to reduce the cooling requirements. And I think they had about 4.5 or 5 hours of cooling water left by the time they got back to close to the Earth, when they detached from the lunar module. But they had about 120 hours of oxygen, because there was a lot of oxygen on the lunar module. They were not short of oxygen at all.
One of the great triumphs of the Apollo 13 rescue was the way in which the team managed to eke out those consumables and go from a situation where the consumables were predicted to be expended before the spacecraft got back, to a point where there was actually a little bit of slack in the consumable store by the time the vehicle returned to Earth.
But despite all of NASA's achievements in stabilizing the situation, one twist of fate remains undeniable. Had the oxygen tank ruptured at a different time during the mission, the astronauts would have been stranded in space with no hope of recovery.
There was a lot of fortunate incidents in 13 that would make it a completely unlucky flight. At the time it happened, I thought it was the worst possible time. Obviously, it was not the worst possible time for this particular incident to happen.
The oxygen tank failure occurred at a distance of about 200,000 miles from the Earth as the spacecraft was approaching the Moon. That is a quite fortuitous place for this to happen. Had the oxygen tank failure happened several hours before the point when it actually did, then the situation would have been very, very difficult. It's very likely that it would not have been possible to stretch the consumables out far enough so that the astronauts still had water and electrical power in time for re-entry. And without power for re-entry, the mission was doomed.
When you lose 2 fuel cells and an oxygen tank and the oxygen runs out of the other and all that, that's something very significant. It'd be very difficult to design against that. We were fortunate that we're on the way to the Moon with the LEM on board, or LEM attached.
If the explosion had happened before they had connected the lunar module round to the command module, then the astronauts couldn't have got into it, so there would have been no lifeboat.
Anytime that you still have the lunar module in the condition that we have it in this case, where we've not used any of its consumables, then we're in a very good situation. We've always called the LEM a good lifeboat under those circumstances. If at any time in the mission, however, the LEM had separated, then it would be a fatal situation.
Had the event happened later, after the lunar module had separated from the command module, after the point where the 2 astronauts bound for the lunar surface had actually detached and were on their way down, or even on the surface, then the situation would have been very serious because of the fact that the command service module would have been left without any power, so communications with the astronauts on the surface would have been not impossible.
You'd have had a dreadful, dreadful situation where the guy going around the Moon was lost, and the 2 guys on the Moon for a while were okay, but then there was no way back for them. So if you're looking for good luck in the Apollo 13 story, it was that it happened when they could rescue them. There were a lot of opportunities before that and after that. If it had happened then, they couldn't have rescued them. So I don't think we should ever believe that rescue was inevitable here. And a lot of the NASA engineers, although publicly they were saying, well, you know, this is fine, their estimate of the chances were below 50-50, and some a lot less than that.
If you're going to have a catastrophic failure of an oxygen tank on a flight to the Moon, then somewhere around about 200,000 miles from the Earth outbound is possibly the best place to have it.
Apollo 13 now 421 nautical miles above the Moon. Just a little over 1 minute now from time of loss of signal with the spacecraft standing by, continuing to monitor. This is Apollo Control, Houston.
we're still something like 70 to 80 hours away from the Earth. I would only guess that the crew feels that the situation is under control, but they were in a serious condition and they knew they had a job to do. If the situation remains stable as it is at the moment, we have the thing under control and we can return the crew safely to the Earth.
With the spacecraft back on course, the consumables stable, and the astronauts surviving in the lunar module, NASA has successfully averted the immediate danger. But with Earth still 250,000 miles away, the return flight is about to present the crew with a whole new series of life-threatening situations.
This is Apollo Control, Houston. We've had loss of signal with Apollo 13 as it passes above the backside of the moon. We're at 77 hours, 9 minutes, now into the flight of Apollo 13.
Next time, in part 2.
Carbon dioxide levels in the lunar module are rising.
There was no way that the astronauts would survive.
What have we got up there? What can we put together to overcome this problem?
The main heat shield was not designed to operate in free space for extended periods of time.
The crew were beginning to suffer.
The spacecraft kept going down in temperature and I was freezing.
It was a dire state. It was a real emergency situation.